Hey guys, Coach Barreline coming with your first installment of your video lessons for Unit 2. During this unit, we'll be talking about progressivism and imperialism. So we're going to get right into progressivism. We've talked about the growth of cities in America and some of the problems that go along with that, go along with industrialization and urban life. Industrialization obviously helps many people, but it also creates dangerous working environments and unhealthy living conditions for the urban poor. So progressivism is a wide-ranging reform movement that tries to target these problems. And progressivism really gets its kickstart from journalists called muckrakers. And the muckrakers were journalists and urban photographers like Jacob Riis, who exposed people to the conditions that the poor faced. The hopes of the muckrakers were that if they exposed these problems, that there would be public pressure on policymakers to do something about it. And one of the most famous muckrakers was Jacob A. Riis. He was a Danish immigrant who himself lived in poverty in New York for a time, and eventually got a job as a crime reporter with I think the New York World. Anyway, so he used his photography and his journalism to expose the plight of the urban poor and working class. Probably the most famous thing is he publishes a book of photography of his photographs called How the Other Half Lives. And his photographs really helped spark the city reforms. Another important muckraker was Ida Tarbell. And she exposed the corrupt Standard Oil Company and its owner, John D. Rockefeller. Basically, she went undercover to basically expose corruption within Standard Oil Company, and this really appealed to middle-class Americans who were scared by the growth of the power of big business. Lincoln Stephan was another writer who wrote Shame of the Cities, which exposed corrupt city governments. And Frank Norris, much like Ida Tarbell, exposed corporate corruption, specifically railroad monopolies and things of that nature in his novel. So you have really three different areas. First, you have of progressivism. First, you have the area addressing poverty and the working class, the area addressing economic and business corruption, and then there was an area attempting to address public corruption as well. One of the main problems with this period was that growing cities couldn't provide necessary services. Urbanization happened so quickly that it outgrew government's ability to take care of it. So garbage collection, safe housing, and police and fire protection were all issues that needed a lot of work during this time. Reformers, many of whom were women during this era like activist Lillian Wald, saw this as an opportunity to expand public health services. So in New York, they passed the Tenement Act of 1901, and the New York State, I should say, not New York City. Tenement Act of 1901 passed the state legislature, and this forces landlords to install lighting in public hallways and at least one toilet for every 2 families. At that time, most apartment buildings didn't have toilets, and if they did, it was like a privy in a basement or an outhouse in the back. And this helps eliminate outhouses in New York slums. Of course, these simple steps improve New York's health. Within 15 years of the Tenement Act of 1901, the death rate in New York had dropped dramatically. And reformers in other states start to use New York as a model. And we'll see this kind of play out over the progressive movement. New York kind of seems to be the more progressive and kind of at the forefront the most progressive city at the forefront of these reforms. Many progressives also fought against prejudice in society. There's various reform groups that formed during this time. The NAACP, or National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is formed during this time. And it's formed actually by a multiracial group of activists in 1909. And they gained notoriety very quickly. 1913, they protested the official introduction of segregation into the federal government in 1913, and also in 1915 they protested the release of D.W. Griffith's film Birth of a Nation, because it contained hostile stereotypes of Black Americans, and it kind of depicted Ku Klux Klan members as heroic figures defending, an American way of life. Also during this time period, you had the establishment of the Anti-Defamation League. And the Anti-Defamation League was formed by a Jewish Chicagoan by the name of Sigmund Livingston. And the purpose of the Anti-Defamation League was to fight against anti-Semitism, or anti-Jewish stereotypes and prejudice. Another area is, of course, the workplace. We've talked about some of the problems with industrial workplaces and how they can be dangerous. Labor unions began to gain power during this period and fight for adult male workers, but very rarely address the problems of women and child workers at the time. However, Florence Kelley was a notorious, or not notorious isn't the right word, but was an effective advocate for children in Illinois, and she actually in 1893 got Illinois to prohibit child labor and to limit women's working hours for the first time in the United States. She also helped organize the Child Labor Committee, which basically tried to convince state by state to ban child labor. And it was very effective. By 1912, nearly 40 states had passed child labor laws. Many of them weren't strictly enforced, and children still had to work. However, progressives mounted state campaigns to limit work days for women, and were successful in Oregon and Utah. However, most workers were still underpaid and lived in poverty, and so you also have this fight developing amongst, or this coalition developing amongst the progressives and labor unions to fight for a minimum wage. However, it's going to be another 20 years or so before minimum wage is passed in 1938. Businesses fight labor laws at every step in the Supreme Court, and several cases are ruled upon concerning workday length during this time. In Lochner versus New York, the court sides with business, saying that a 10-hour workday would deny the workers' rights to negotiate their own contracts and work as long as they want to. Muller versus Oregon, however, the court upheld a state law that establishes a 10-day workday for women in laundries and factories, and the attorney for that case, Louis Brandeis, will become eventually a Supreme Court justice, but he was the attorney for the state of Oregon, and he argued that there was evidence that proved long hours harmed women's health. The Brandeis case, or as it's called, the Brandeis brief, is what his defense was called, became a model for similar cases. And using the same tactics in Bunting versus Oregon, the state led the court to uphold a law that extended the protection of a 10-day workday to men as well as women. Oftentimes, however, it took tragedy to move governments to act. In 1911, one such tragedy happened. About 500 women working in a Triangle Shirtwaist Company factory. It was basically a sweatshop. It was a high-rise building that made women's blouses. And just there as they were ending the day, a small fire broke out, and it quickly spread to 3 floors. Escape was impossible for many women. We watched a video, obviously, that talked about it. The doors were locked to prevent theft. There was a flimsy fire escape that collapsed under pressure. The exit was too narrow, and the fire was too high for fire ladders to reach to effectively fight the fire. So more than 140 men and women died in the fire. And this does mark a turning point in labor reform movements. New York State, very soon after, passed the toughest fire safety laws in the nation. And again, much like the Tenement Act, they become a model for nationwide action. During this time, labor unions also gain a little bit of kind of moxie, so to speak. In 1900, the ILGW, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, organizes unskilled labor, which is one of the first unions to do that. In 1909, they called a general strike that they called the Uprising of the 20,000. And it was so effective that it did actually win a shorter work week and higher wages and attracted thousands of more people to the union. Another more radical union was the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, and they actually opposed capitalism, and they tried to pick off unskilled workers that the AFL had ignored. They were led by William Big Bill Haywood, and they were known as Wobblies, and they used traditional tactics like strikes and boycotts, but they also did industrial sabotage, breaking machinery and things of that nature. They did lead 23,000 textile workers in Massachusetts to protest pay cuts, and it actually ended successfully after 6 weeks. The pay wasn't cut. However, there were several IWW strikes that were failures, and their radical ideology led to a government crackdown on the organization, and within a few years, it was in major decline. Another major push of progressivism was regulating government and kind of trying to clean out the corruption. And this begins at the city levels. In order to properly reform government, you got to have influence, right? So Tom Johnson was the mayor of Cleveland during this time, and he becomes a major reformer during this time period. He sets new rules for police. He ends the practice of using debtors' prisons and supports a fair or progressive tax system. There's other types of governments that form during this time in cities. In Galveston, Texas, after a major hurricane, the people realized that there's no way that one person could be responsible for the rebuilding, so they set up a committee of 5 people to each be responsible for one area of city government. This begins what we now know as the commission form of city government. Also, you have the development of city manager model that has a professional administrator rather than a politician actually manage and run the day-to-day operations of the government. On the state level, you have many governors that are pursuing progressive paths as well. Robert La Follette in Wisconsin, Fighting Bob La Follette as he's known as, he pushes direct primary elections, limits on campaign spending, as well as commissions to regulate the railroads, oversee transportation, civil service, taxation, all sorts of things to kind of open up government and make it more transparent. Other governors pushed for reform, but some were corrupt. New York's Charles Evans Hughes regulated insurance companies, and Mississippi's James Vardaman actually did a lot of building of roads and things of that nature, but he did engage in race baiting and exploited prejudice to gain and hold power, as many politicians during that time did. At the national level, the push for reform has more to do with voting rights and making elections fair. So people proposed a direct primary or election in which voters choose who's going to run for election. Before that, a convention chose, and most, even though we still have conventions, they use the votes to show who gets the nomination. They also, progressives backed the 17th Amendment, which gave voters, not state legislatures, the right to elect their U.S. senators. So some measures progressives fought for include the direct primary, where voters select the party's candidate for public office; 17th Amendment, which is direct election of senators; the secret ballot, which allows people to vote privately so they can't be influenced by fear of coercion; initiative allows citizens to propose new laws; referendums allow citizens to vote on proposed or existing laws that have been passed. And of course, the recall election allows voters to remove an elected official for office. So you see a lot of change, a lot of different areas that the progressives are working in, but their changes are going to have immense impacts on our future as a nation going forward. We'll see you next time.